All right, we are live. Hello, YouTube. I'm Christopher Robert Stum. This is Wes. James, do you want to introduce yourself?
James?
All right. Yeah, I can
There's a bit of a delay.
My name is James Cobb. I am a doctoral candidate at UNC Chapel Hill in the Department of English and Comparative Literature. I study contemporary African American lit and metaphysics as well. And so what my research mainly revolves around is kind of trying to find an ordinary space for Black life, kind of where Black life can intend in a certain way outside of, say, anti-Blackness.
And do you focus on trying to concretize it to, shall we say, more of making it beyond just something of an abstraction that person may not be able to like have a visceral relation with, but maybe an experience, right?
Yeah. So one of the distinctions that happens in this type of study that comes from a philosopher, Frantz Fanon, is there's this idea of, say, like lived experience versus kind of more abstract definitions of Blackness that try to, say, unify some sort of identity. And so there are many contemporary theorists that talk about, you obviously don't want to talk about Black people in the African diaspora as a monolith, but you do want to kind of talk about problems that affect and kind of deal with the subjectivity of Black individuals, but you want to do that in a way that doesn't continue like fully write away their actual experience of like lived in everyday life.
Right, and it's a difficult dilemma, right? Because the more we try to refine an argument, especially as academics, the more we risk losing the substantiveness that may be derivable from lived experience.
Yeah, and then you get into this, what is the ultimate agenda of, say, these different either writers, authors, or academics? Do you want to talk about more the political ramifications and how to change the political standing of the African diaspora, or do you want to more define, what the individual subjectivity of a Black person is? And then you want to kind of do so. Everyone wants to do somewhat of both at the same time, but they seem somewhat opposed. And getting the ability to talk about both at once, is very, very difficult things to do.
Right. So tell me a little bit about why you recommended the book that you did, and we can begin diving into it.
So the book is The Sellout by Paul Beatty. If I remember correctly, it came out in 2016. One of the reasons why I wanted to get into it is, so the novel, just kind of very broadly, is about an unnamed narrator who lives in LA. He's the son of a Black psychologist who lives on a farm. He ends up becoming essentially a slave master to a different Black character, and then his city gets unincorporated and then reincorporated through his efforts, and also he ends up resegregating his city. So as you can see, like, it's also done in a satirical way, but it's essentially like trying to talk about ways in which to improve Black life while at the same time satirizing ways in which current thinkers and writers and politicians are trying to improve Black life, because as he segregates the city, life gets better, which you don't seem to want to admit racism and then have life get better during that at the same time. It seems an odd conflict, and it seems something really interesting to kind of get into and think about.
Which I found funny because it kind of almost compounds the satirism, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Right, because it's already a satire, but when you add on top of that in it's not quite a narrative structure, shall we say a pseudo narrative structure, right? In this pseudo narrative structure, you suddenly have on top of the satirism that's already used, the irony of segregation being, in this case, a betterment of social situations, or shall we say cohesion.
Mm-hmm.
And so, go ahead.
Oh, I think that's a good point, because like one thing that that satire does is it like looks at something so intensely and looking at it in that way, makes it funny by showing how ridiculous it is, but at the same time, the idea of getting past a certain segregation that exists in society is equally ridiculous as well. I think which is a key point that Paul Beatty is kind of pointing to.
So let's just dive into some hot topics, because this book is obviously it's controversial in what it's a satire potentially of. It has broader ethical, political implications, right? So do you want to dive into some of the worldviews that it kind of implicitly or directly addresses, or perhaps informs, and we can go from there? Doesn't have to be all of them, of course, just any one of them.
I'm sorry, did you cut out for a second there? Would you mind just?
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. So since it's rather clear that this book, it kind of motivates a repository of political and potentially ethical questions.
Mm-hmm.
Hey there, Andrew. Welcome aboard. Just going to pull up Andrew. Hey there.
Hello.
And so before, so basically one of the things that's interesting about this book, right, and basically what we're here to really discuss are what it's a satire of, which is, as I said earlier before I, derailed to discuss, welcoming Andrew, was the political, socio-economical, and potentially, shall we say, philosophical implications. And James, do you want to dive into some of the potential worldviews from which we could perhaps use said views as a lens to begin our excavation of the world?
All right. Well, I guess one key aspect, and it's very broad, but I guess a quick thing to get into that this novel deals with is what type of political action is best suited to forward the interests of a Black community. So essentially, like, what do you do to make Black life better? And I guess to get into a very particular aspect of it is, like, with the novel itself, what type of literature is best suited for creating political action for Black communities? So, like, so if you look at other things, like Native Son, which shows kind of like the violence that Black life is subjected to, or say like the slave narrative of Frederick Douglass, which shows the horrors of slavery. You also have more fantastic novels. There's also one that with the class with the Christopher that we've done, which is Kindred, which has the main character going back and forth in time between slavery. Or you have satire. Is satire and a very like in your face, offensive satire best suited for advancing a political movement?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Andrew. And by the way, why don't you introduce yourself?
Oh, okay. My name's Andrew Pauly. I live in Trenton, Missouri, and I am a para at the elementary school here. So a lot of downtime now with all the COVID-19 stuff. And I majored in history and I'm really into the Middle Ages. So yeah, that's me.
All right, so here's my question then, guys. I don't know how much each of you has read the book. So, James has read a lot of it. James has read probably more books than any of us put together, I would conjecture. Well, I'm not joking. Like, he once told me in a discussion, that they would casually assign like 700 pages of reading for like just, one assignment.
I believe it. I believe it. Even in a history major, you read a lot.
Yeah.
And I didn't read everything I was assigned.
But my question is this, okay? One of the things that this book potentially motivates is a claim about the state of maybe African Americans, as I said, before, is too precise because it's not sufficiently broad to encapsulate the set of all people that are affected by this. But whatever demographic it would pertain to, shall we say, without risking sounding offensive, but also excluding potential people in our analysis. What ramifications would it have on that demographic of people post-slavery in the United States? Because it seems that one of the things that this book is a satire of is that.
Yeah. I didn't read the whole book. I got to about chapter 5, but a really, really distinct image in my mind is everything that you get experiment. I was out with my dogs while I was listening to it, and it just really made me want to puke almost. It was very, very challenging.
Yeah, I'm not smiling because I'm thinking about the book. I'm just smiling because of the signal. That's all.
I mean, I'll just say one thing. Like, it's always interesting to hear people's like reaction to like how offensive and how kind of in your face this book can be about certain kind of racial issues. Where like, and I think that's one of the key aspects of his style of writing, is to not sugarcoat, just have everything be as like offensive as possible. And one thing that I like to kind of question is like, it's offensive, but it's also satire, and so a lot of these things that come up, these jokes are reliant upon you having a certain understanding of what the punchline is.
Yeah.
And so like the reason it's funny or like upsetting is because it's always implicating you in the jokes and in how horrible these preconceived notions and stereotypes of these groups of people that you're dealing with are.
Yeah.
To get into that, it's always, why is he doing that? Why, it's very deliberate and very continuous. Like, why would he make you want to, throw up as you're reading this book? Why would he elicit that reaction?
Yeah, that social experiment where he's looking in the mirror and he's trying to, and he's just trying to ask him questions, and then he has to shock himself every time he gets it wrong. I didn't completely understand the context of that, and it was very interesting. Maybe you could elaborate on that.
So cut out for a second, but I guess if I can jump in.
Yes, if you can elaborate on that part, James.
Specifically when he would like shock himself when getting something wrong.
Yeah.
So like, so that part of the novel is like so for people who haven't gotten there, his father was a psychologist known as a nigger whisperer, and he would go, and whenever anybody was any black man in LA was going crazy, they'd call him in, and he would talk them down from doing something ridiculous.
Okay.
So his father also, and he calls it like treated him like Anna Freud. So his father experiments on him as a child in a lot of various different ways. So essentially, there's also one horrible one where his father wants to see if I forget the name of the psychological term, but essentially it's the case that if someone has a health accident and then someone needs to call, or the bystander effect, I think somebody has to call 911. If there's too many people, the more people there are, the less likely anybody is to call.
Yeah.
And so
the bystander effect.
Yeah, to do this,
yeah,
the father beats the shit out of the son to see if anyone would step in, and instead they all join in and help attack the son.
Yeah.
And so he does all these experiments, and I think one thing is, again, getting into kind of like the underlying aspects of the novel, is like, what is psychology supposed to do, for a community or for the people? Like, what is the ultimate like goal of psychology? Because like and then also like, what is the ultimate goal of raising a child, and like putting those two in conflict? So if his goal as a psychologist is to just move the field forward, then to study, a young black man might move the field forward, even if it's torturing that person. And so he's also doing his job and helping society in a way, but he's also violating, not mentally torturing your children as a rule, which I guess, I don't know a ton about Freud, but he might have been doing similar things.
So here's the question that the novel kind of implicitly points towards that I'd like us to, each just conjecture about. Is segregation a necessarily bad thing?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah,
I have to say I don't know. I want, my gut reaction is to say no. It has to be a bad thing, but like, but then again, like if you get into discussions about slavery, for instance, throughout history, has that always been a bad thing? And
right. You make a good point.
I actually have some quotations from a book that I read for one of my history classes. Oh, looks like I'm freezing.
That's okay. Not on my side.
Okay. It's called Plantation Slavery on the East Coast of Africa by Frederick Cooper. He says that if slaves had less control over their own lives than other members of society, their owners also had greater responsibility for their welfare and even for their actions towards others. Of course, the context is this is African slavery we're talking about before the transatlantic slave trade. And another thing and then when talking about slavery in the colonies, he says, whatever slave code said, they may have had little effect on what slaves actually experienced. I'm talking about like there have been regulations, but it's not necessarily true that everyone's going to follow those regulations.
What do you think, James?
Sorry, I missed the last half of that. I got the quote, and then I missed the second half of your point. So I want to be sure I'm responding correctly to what you're saying.
Okay. So the second half was that even though there were regulations in like Spain and stuff that were supposed to make the slavery in the colonies less severe, it wasn't necessarily going to be followed by the slave owners themselves in the colonies. The encomiendas were still going to do the terrible things that they wanted to do, or the encomienda system was still going to be terrible, kind of. If that makes sense. I don't know. Maybe that's not relevant.
Well, here's the point. It may not be perfectly well formed, but that's okay if it's not. What we're looking for are kernels of intuition from which to extrapolate broader questions, right? We're not requiring of you to make a perfectly concise point, rather to motivate interesting questions, which I think your points actually have. The broader implication is that it's potentially an empirical set of data points to make complicated the analysis of our excavation of whether or not we should always segregate or not, right? Because and if you start to look at the question of segregation, which is clearly one of the satirical components of this book, if you then conjunct that question with many of the appeals, of desegregation and of equal representation, suddenly it's not clear whether a pseudo unidimensional appeal is ideal.
Yeah, I'm wondering what James has to say about that. Because I don't feel like I'm qualified to say anything.
Well, we're fools on this together,
I agree with it, but
what do you think, Wes? Because you've been kind of quiet.
Well, I don't know. I think there's definitely. Well, I agree with Philosophy Queen. I'm not sure who that is, but I think there is a psychological aspect. I think there's something definitely wrong with segregation. I mean, there's no doubt about that to me.
Is it segregation though?
But
or is it
it's intrinsic to it, or
right?
Really, I think it's a result of it.
And to be clear for the audience, I'm not, by asking this question, saying let's segregate. I want to make that as clear as I possibly can. I'm not.
Yes.
I don't want people to think Chris is calling for segregation. I'm asking because it's an assumption that I think oftentimes can go unchecked, right? So
yeah.
What was the author's intent by doing that's what I'm wondering. James, do you kind of have an idea of that?
Yeah, so one thing I still like, again, in the novel, the guy's town gets disincorporated or unincorporated, and then he reincorporates it, and then decides to segregate it. And then he realizes once he segregates it, that people's lives get better. And so, like, you can, or like, so let me get more into the nuance. Not only does he segregate it, he essentially kicks all white people out of the area of LA. Like he makes it a black and people of color only area.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so then what happens is also, so one big thing is there's a school that's there, public school, which is essentially just Latinx and black kids, and they build a fake white private school across the street, and then they realize that the number that the students of color are start doing better and better at the school. So it's like, why would segregation make their lives better? I mean, there's obviously like a lot of thought about like how to improve, schoolings or the school and education of students of color. And a lot of it is like, okay, well, we just need to make their education as similar to the education of rich white kids as possible. Those students who do the best and have the most funds allocated to them. And so you have the segregation, you see the school, and they can kind of feel the way in which they're not being adequately treated, and they can feel that distance and distinction between themselves and this other school, and then they do better in a sense of competition against this school is, say, one possible reading of it. Another is that like they don't always have to perform as black, in relationship to white people coming in to their communities would be another possible reading. But essentially, segregation happens unless you put up barriers to it, right? Like the United States is getting more and more segregated just from income inequality. So like, how do you help people in a society which I guess like Philosophy Queen was saying will continue to segregate itself even if there isn't necessarily legislation to put people in a certain area?
And James, it may not even be, shall we say, something that people are self-authoring, right? It could be a tide that people find themselves carried on. You want me to repeat the signal cut?
I think so.
Yeah, I'll repeat just to be safe. It may be also that it's not an individual behavioral phenomenon, right? But perhaps a tide that people find themselves carried on.
Well, so I think that's a good point. The difference between, say, like the individual and the individual and the bigger political movement, right? Like it's often the case that like when gentrification starts, and the first people moving there don't feel like they are, caring or going to change the society in which that they've moved into. But then a huge tide happens, and that can force people out of certain neighborhoods. But I mean, yes. So I mean, I guess the question then to discuss is, what is the individual's responsibility in relationship to, say, what they perceive as larger political movements, right? How do you impact the political standing of individuals or of a community as a single individual?
As far as sorry.
I mean, to take it back to the novel quickly, the narrator is only able to like elicit change in bringing back the city, right? His whole goal is to make a community reappear, not to do anything necessarily for himself.
That's interesting.
Interesting.
I was going to say something, or just a thought about the segregation. What isn't all segregation, even when we do it by ourselves, got some drawbacks? I mean, I'm thinking of like prison. You'll find blacks and whites separate themselves, and Latinos too will separate themselves automatically.
I think it depends on.
I don't know that you could force them to all sit together so much, and I don't know how to do that, but I think that does cause problems where if they did sit and not see each other as so different as two in groups, that maybe they wouldn't see each other as different. We wouldn't have the race problems we do.
So it may be possible. It may be possible that the question I asked was not initially well formed. You see, because there may be a logical distinction between a phenomenological separation that is not, of any conscious origin, shall we say, right? And segregation as a principle. There may be a lack of refinement that has resulted in a question that isn't necessarily sufficiently well formed. But I think, however we may try to make more precise the definition of segregation, the reason I asked the question was to then motivate an additional question that Andrew kind of briefly touched on, which was, what would be the ethical implications of, say, equal representation as it relates to the challenge of arguing for an intrinsically bad parameter associated with the segregation? That is to say, is it possible that equal representation, and by that I mean, say, in a demographic, right, whatever, some chosen parameter, can that actually turn into segregation? And in what instances would that be undesirable? And in what instances would that be desirable? I don't know.
Wait, so if maybe get what you're saying right. So you're saying that if there was equal representation and then there was segregation, but the representation was, markedly
to basically
would that be
to enforce it, right?
Necessarily a bad thing.
Well, in other words, what I'm pointing out is some people might say at one breath that they're against segregation, but then continue to purport that they are for equal representation. But if natural phenomena are such that equal representation is not likely, right, it seems that there would need to be some social structure to, if possible, maintain a particular equal demographic in such a way that it almost borders dangerously close to the very practice of segregation that some people may be opposed to, right? And not to say that it's intrinsically a bad thing, right? But there is a potential for conflict there that I noticed is not so much obvious to a person that doesn't start to think through the possible ramifications.
Well, so to keep thinking through that, so like, how would you put that, say, in practical terms, or say make that into like an example of how you might see that working?
Let's say we want a equal percentage composition of various ethnicities. So let S be a sample population, and let's say there exist N subgroups of, the problem is the very grouping itself seems arbitrary because we're choosing phenotypical traits, right? So like whatever we select for, there will be a countable number for this set of demographics, right? Whatever, maybe it's arbitrary, but whatever we select for, as the population continues to, reproduce, depending on how it grows, we may or may not have to not represent proportionally the rate of reproduction in the demographic composition of the school, right? And so we might unwittingly start to stratify some subsets of the some groups, meaning we might segregate a subset of those groups in ways that we didn't intend through artificial means of a social structure.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, are you guys? So, I mean, are you fairly aware of the like affirmative action and how, like?
Yes. Yeah.
You'll be like, so like, I really know this because I taught like a law class last semester, and we talked about with the University of Michigan, like law school, their case with Bollinger, however long ago that was, where there you have, that was a worry that if you're selecting students based only on race as the factor of whether they're getting into a particular school, that's a form of racial discrimination because you're saying, only letting them get coming because of that factor, and they're seen as being like segregating this group and having a quota of how many students are allowed of a certain race into the school. And so the Supreme Court said, okay, that's illegal. You can't segregate them out. That the only way in which it is legal is if there are no quotas and if race is a factor amongst many other factors. That essentially you're not allowed to segregate racially in admitting students, right? You can count their race as a part of their dossier, that because they are of a certain race, they may have been oppressed and might have different perspective to offer. That's good for all students, that as compared to not having that perspective, available. I mean, because essentially, I think one thing that like to think through this is like, the separate but equal, after the Civil War, when like with Jim Crow, that you can have separate schools as long as the schools are equal. If it was proven that those schools were equal, would we, in terms of like giving the students a certain education and just in terms of like passing tests, would we still want, or would that still be legal to have them separate? And we would still want that as a society with certain values? I mean, I think we don't necessarily have to get into your own personal responses, but I think one reason this court case said that you wouldn't want it that way is that there's some value to having people of different life perspectives intermingling with each other and giving each other different perspectives and ideas that might not be linked to one particular society. Because you have, say, to look at other countries, say like France or other countries, talk about integration. Would you want, an integrated society into which, there is, say, a particular set of values that holds, over all others?
Yeah. I might have something to add to that. It's not anything I wrote down in preparation for this, but it's kind of going back to the idea where race has to be a factor, but it can't be the main deciding thing. Because like there might be other people who may feel discriminated. Like apparently, just affirmative action and discrimination. Well, I'm not sure if you would say it was discrimination based off of race, but I do know that Asian Americans found that kind of problematic because they might get the short end of the stick because someone who had less developed, who may have had less experience would be getting in when they had been doing all of the work too. And Asians found that discriminatory. And I learned that in my Asian American class. Is that kind of what you were saying? Or could that be a factor?
Well, so because there's a new case, I'm not sure if it's actually gone to the Supreme Court, but it's gone through several appellate courts about Asian Americans. That like, it gets complicated, right? Because you're like, okay, we did this well on the test, and that's what's required. So if we did this well on the test, we should get in. And a certain percentage of us do this well in schools, and so we should get in because of that. And it is discrimination in like the baseline sense of you are making judgments about people based upon race. But I think one fundamental thing about this text that it gets into is like, when is that not the case? Like, when are you not considering someone's race, gender, sexuality, and thinking through a person? Like, it's impossible to abstract a person outside of their culture and their especially their political moment. So, like, you want to control the degree to which you consider these things, but the idea and the reason why, like, the jokes are funny in the novel. Is because you are already thinking about, like, when you think about a Black person, you have this set of cultural, you have a cultural milieu that you put them into, and you have these different things about them that you're already thinking about just because of your experience with all Black people that you've had in your life and the way America thinks about the Black community. And so it's impossible to take that person completely out of that. And so with, say, like, Asian Americans saying we should only focus, or with this, not all Asian Americans, obviously, but this lawsuit, like, hey, we should take race out as much as possible. It's never going to be the case that race, even in just your test scores, is completely removed from what the results of that exam are. Yeah,
I think I didn't really concretize very well what I meant. So you guys see what I'm. Okay, let's see if I can maybe make a little bit more clear what I intend. What I'm trying to say is, like, suppose that I had like a group, right? And that I could choose sets of parameters to partition this group in such a way that I could now define subgroups, right? And maybe they're based on phenotypical properties, maybe they're not, but But what I'm pointing out is if the rate of growth for these is such that they're not like if the size of these circles is representative, say, of the population growth rate, but I want an equal percentage. So if this is my school, right? Then if I have a mapping from any one of these sets, an equal percent composition will imply that I'm now segregating, if like say some subset of this population, this subpopulation, such that only a subset of it can actually go to this school, right? So what I'm asking basically is in part, because it depends on how we define segregation, but what I'm asking is, so maybe implicit in this is, what is the definition of segregation? And once we fix a definition, so is segregation just a separation of groups with literal or implicit barriers to, interaction that is imposed or implicitly instantiated from members of the society, or whatever the definition is, can it turn out to be the case that when you try to actually make something more inclusive, you end up stratifying groups not only from each other, but also a subgroup from itself?
Yeah. I think James might say something similar to this, but I would say that it kind of depends on the context. Because we have the whole history of the terrors of the transatlantic slave trade. We have Jim Crow. We have all of that stuff that happened, and there are still remnants from that. And to what extent, like, when do we decide when the remnants are gone, and if the remnants that are there are less than how much better we've got? I don't know necessarily, but I would still say that there are remnants there. We see racism now, and it has a certain context.
What do you think, James? What is racism? Like, if you had to define it?
Well, like, so one thing that I've always had with racism and sexism and a lot of those things, I want to say the philosopher's Yancey, Charles Yancey, I think is his name. But anyway, it's this idea that, like, say if you take it out of race and just move it to, say, sexism. Like, as a man, you can never be fully not sexist, right? And so like same thing with race, like, you can never be fully non-racist. Like, you can certainly do a lot better, but the big thing is, like, in order to fight and counteract it, there has to be this understanding that everybody at every time is to a certain degree racist. And this is, I think, why the distinction is different. Like, not racist in the fact that you are, acting the same way as a slaveholder, in the early 19th century, but you're racist in the way that, like, race informs the way you're thinking about things, just because it underlies so much structure in how Americans deal with each other. So it's essentially the main way I often have to think about racism is that it just impacts the way in which you think about people of other races and even yourself, and that it's underlying and never fully invisible, or maybe it might be invisible, but that, like, it's always there in the way in which your societal relations occur, and that, like, when it appears invisible, it's there. And that's why, like, to go back to kind of like the Asian American lawsuit at Harvard, the idea that, like, you can get past it in that one race cannot be discriminated against, I think is it has issues with it.
And do you think instances, obviously not all instances of discrimination are segregation, but those instances of segregation that we might say are discriminatory, right, insofar as they relate to the previous concerns raised, right, is there therefore a further challenge to the claim that we may, be able to through equal representation, right, of various phenotypical traits selected for, minimize this phenomenologically.
Well, I mean, it gets difficult, right? Because then you have to get into what would make representation equal, right? Like, so if you have, say, say for instance, like before the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, like you had people building houses, and like you wouldn't necessarily think of including disabled people as like including voice in those discussions, but like they would need, say, an outsized voice because the building impacts them, more substantially than people who aren't disabled, because like they won't even be able to get inside of it, depending on what it is. So then you have to get into, okay, what makes an equal representation, and how can you account for people who might be disproportionately affected by, say, a building. Like, say you're going to build a new dump, and you're like, okay, we'll just put it in this neighborhood that has low property, or the value of property is less. But then, okay, then that's probably based upon society in America. It's probably going to be people of color in that area. And like, so would that equal representation for that issue have to figure them more than others? I mean, so it gets there's so many variables.
So are you talking about intersectionality, like the intersectionality between race, class, and gender, and how you kind of need to add more things to that? Like, say disabilities, age, and intellect even? Are you saying something like that? And how those like intersect in different ways?
So like, I guess intersectionality comes into that's not explicitly what I'm thinking through. It definitely comes into play that, you definitely have to think through how people are affected by certain things in ways that might not affect you, or that you might not even use to identify your own personality or subjectivity. Like, for instance, if you are heterosexual, you may not even think through the way that sexuality will come into play in certain
Oh yeah, I should have mentioned sexuality. Thank you.
But for instance, I dated this girl once, and she was asking for like a route home, and I gave her the most direct route. But I'm not a small guy, and she's told me, I can't go through there, like at that time of night. And I was like, why? It's just go right there. And she's like, well, she's a woman, so she has to think through, physical violence happening to her based upon this route, where that would never even occur to me, because I'll just walk there and not be an issue. So go ahead, yeah.
Oh, sorry. So would you say that this is kind of like, okay, admittedly, I have not read this book, but apparently, I think a constitutional law professor wrote a book called Was Blind, But Now I See. And it talks about something she describes as the transparency phenomena, which is the idea that it's hard for me, as a white cis male, to imagine what the hardships of someone who would be like a person of color, be of a lower class, be maybe transgender, have a disability, and be old, and kind of have sexuality preferences that go outside the norm, and how that might affect that person who has all of those traits more than someone like me. Kind of, maybe.
Yeah. So definitely, like, I think that comes into play, and I also think that like the idea, especially with like legislation, or the idea that it's not just those things aren't discussed doesn't mean they shouldn't be considered, right? Like the idea that a law that doesn't talk about those things, is the most equal law, I think is an issue, right? Or even like not necessarily the law, but even like, say, fiction or whatever you want everyone to kind of talk about it. That just because you're not talking about them and not thinking about them doesn't mean that they aren't, interwoven in what you're actually discussing.
So here's the question. How do we prioritize growth which is not really well defined. You know, what we mean by that is progression towards some set of ideals, right? Whatever progression means, if the thing in question is metrizable, right, or the set of states, you know, converging on this ideal, whatever it may be, if it's physically instantiable. But how do we prioritize that while requiring equality?
Mm-hmm.
If the very thing, it seems definitionally requires, if we're not there yet, right? So that and
I hope
that,
not, you cut off a bit, so I hope I'm not cutting you off.
no, go ahead.
So like if you go to the novel, there's a couple of characters who, or not one, just Floyd Cheshire wants to rewrite Mark Twain, and he wants to make it so he's rewriting it and like not having it be racist at all, right? Like he wants to take everything offensive out of the text, and he does this for a lot of different things. So he keeps trying to rewrite these books about that consider Black life, but in a way that isn't offensive or doesn't play negatively towards a Black subjectivity at all. And he sees this as growth, where like, oh, you like, so for instance, in Mark Twain is like, oh, we can never use the N-word because the N-word is offensive, so we're going to rewrite every book that talks about it while taking it out, because that's growth, because then you'll have less offensive things available to Black people. And the narrator responds to this by saying he wants to put the N-word in it more, because like you're not going to get rid of that aspect of Black life or Black people being looked down upon by whites, and it still just exists, or just it still exists today, maybe in a different permutation, but it still exists today, just as it existed, 150 years ago. So what's the use in trying to pretend it doesn't exist? So, but then you get to this issue of, is life better? How has it improved for the Black community? And how do you move forward, or do you just put up your hands and forget about it? I mean, I'm not sure of an answer about what is that step forward, and how do you move to a set of goals? But
yeah, I definitely would feel a little, at least the history enthusiast in me would feel a little squeamish about censoring out what was in history, but at the same time, maybe like changing things to be unoffensive. But I like the idea of like reappropriating something to give it a different context, and I think I might be able to think of some examples of what you say. Like I know the N-word is used a lot in like Luke Cage, and it's used in like a Black or person of color brotherhood type way, and things like that. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
It may have cut out. That's why he's not responding.
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry.
Andrew was kind of talking about using the N-word. And I've heard both sides of the argument of Blacks should go ahead and use it in rap because then it'll give less power to the word. And yet, everybody using it. Or do you? I don't know. Is it better for them to use the word a lot and try to lose the power, or not use it at all?
Let us from now on say perhaps when and if, right, in the question, because that kind of contextualizes that we're not asking the question broadly without considering that obviously this will be contextual, right?
Yeah. I think Christopher brings up a really good point that like it's like with any word, it's what is the use of the word? If the use of the N-word is to make a Black person feel lesser and feel like an object, then you shouldn't be allowed to use that. If you're using it, but like, then there's also the problem of like, so like in the text, so for the way the novel is talking about it, like looking back at Mark Twain and like leaving it in there, is obviously important because like it's necessary for you in reading that book to be aware of the way in which Blacks stood in that society. So we never want to get rid of that. But then there's this whole issue of you can't get rid of the word entirely, because then like the only way for the word to never exist again would be if all of a sudden Black people were entirely equal in all society. and then you wouldn't need the word anymore. So like, I'm sure people would be willing to trade the one for the other.
Yeah.
Once that equality happens, I mean, it'd be like any demeaning word for a woman or a person of a certain sexuality. Like, I'm like, the word will always have the certain weight to it just because of the way in which that community stands in that particular society. It's one reason why like there aren't very many offensive words towards the people of the higher class, right? Because like, what do they care? They're already in that higher class, so
Yeah.
the word doesn't mean as much as their own standing, right?
I can't call Chris a white cis and him get mad about it. Unfortunately.
I mean, I don't know if that's fortunate or unfortunate. I mean, as far as I'm aware, it doesn't upset me, you know. But I think there aren't many things that do. I think I'm kind of weird like that.
Yeah, but I mean, like the ruling class, just kind of generally, it's like, yeah, you can say a word that might offend them, but you know, then they go to their nice house and their well-stocked fridge and have their cook make them food. They're not thinking about it anymore, right? Whereas if they say it and you have to go into a slum, like the problem with the word again is what it means and the fact that it draws on the social standing and the oppression that exists, and it reaffirms that. And so you go into a life that reaffirms the way that people have objectified you is the issue with it. But again, because the objectification is there, the word also needs to exist to remind people that it's there as well. And I think that's one thing this novel really gets at, and the reason why Paul Beatty continues to do these things that are so offensive. And the segregation is like the segregation and objectification of Black life isn't gone. I mean, it may be different, it may not, not as bad, but like it's still there.
Yeah. It kind of makes me think. Would you say that Frantz Fanon is a good example of kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, definitely say like. The look at Negro moment, the inability to define Black life outside of, to talk to like a more modern term, like anti-Blackness. And so there's a lot of discussion that occurs now about like, okay, if Black life is figured through this anti-Blackness, where is the space for like a positive Black life, or like, where is the possible future, so the school of like Afrofuturism, like where is this goal? And there's obviously like a lot of different schools figuring different things about it. But like, where is this growth ultimately? And where is like the promised land, so to speak?
Well, here's a question. Phenotypical traits among hominid species seem to be, particularly in melanin amongst skin, due to like a globalized economy. The estimated trajectories are that we should see more mixing of melanin, right? So what might that imply about the state of Blackness, or any particular set of phenotypical traits that we try to select for related to melanin composition?
Oh, so are you saying something about like
what does it mean? In other words, what I'm motivating is it can't well mean that to be Black is only to have a certain composition of melanin in your skin. Because if that's what it means, that can go away more easily than meaning that if, say that you have two African-American parents, by whatever standards we would determine that set. But for whatever reason, you have a mutation that makes the pigmentation in your skin lighter, right? And so would that person not be Black? That seems as strange. In other words, it can't well be simply that it's the phenotypical traits that a person possesses.
Yeah. We can't just look at it in terms of skin color alone necessarily, even though it's a factor.
Or facial structure or musculoskeletal composition. It seems that it's sort of possibly comparable to what James was saying in the beginning in his conjecture about the importance of a lived experience and the connection between generations of how those lived experiences are related.
Yeah, I mean, it gets complicated, but I think you put to a good point. Like, there's the African diaspora, so like anybody who's descended from someone who lived in Africa at some point, right?
Yeah, right. If we generalize enough, yeah, right.
Yeah, and then there's the but I mean, like, if you obviously how many generations back and whatever, but like then there's also like the ethnic aspect of it, like the series of shared cultural aspects, music, arts, literature, folklore, all that stuff that can be handed down and passed on, cuisine and whatnot. But I mean, that's also a very difficult question, because you're like, who is black? Is it a choice? Like, can you just deny all your black culture? And
if we want to make it inflammatory, let's just, I guess I'll be the one to take the heat. Can I be black? Right? I mean,
we've already had a woman try that, and she was fired.
You're right, but you get what I'm saying. I don't think I can, but the philosophy is not clear.
Yeah, because the part, like, so I mean, I don't know your cultural heritage, but it could be like, could you be, Australian at a certain extent, right? Like, at this point in your life, can you become an Australian?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, go ahead.
Okay. So I know, Christopher, that you don't like this particular YouTuber. Oliver Thorne has a video on his Philosophy Tube channel that kind of goes.
Just real quick, what do you mean?
Okay. Sorry.
You mean like I don't find his arguments rigorous?
Yes.
But you can probably tell.
That's what I mean.
But to be fair, you can probably tell I'm being really relaxed in this conversation, right? So it's like,
yes,
it's okay.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Okay. So he brings up on one of his older videos around that he made in 2016. He brings up this argument by a philosopher called Falguni Sheth, who has a book called a political philosophy of race, and talks about how it's not just skin color. I haven't read the book yet, but I plan to. But it's not just skin color, but you can also say it's a political category in a way.
It seems to be culture as well.
I mean, just to chime in, I would agree with that. I mean, it's complicated because, and this is one point I guess we're getting to in the beginning, that like there is no, say, like, monolithic definition of what blackness is or what it means to be black. And so, like, the moment in which you try to figure an absolute definition of black people, it's fundamentally flawed, because however you define it, by phenotype or political group or heritage, there are always some people who you would want to leave out, who you would naturally assume are black. I mean, because Christopher, so obviously, going back to the inflammatory point, like, you're not black, right? It's like we all
I don't think I'm black.
That, yeah. And so the thing is that, like, you would have to find a definition. If you were going to label you as black, we'd have to find a definition of black that would work for you. So if we just said, like, okay, anybody who's black who has their heritage back to Africa, then, like, the whole human race at some point can trace their heritage back to Africa, who is not black at that point.
Possibly another question we could have is, would we say that race itself is like a 18th century construct, or can we talk about race before the 18th century? Because I know that there are arguments
about it before then, but
yeah.
So I mean, depending on who you're reading, but what it's often, some people will say that the moment that black people, in terms of race as relates to blackness, the moment in which people were enslaved based upon being from Africa and their skin color, and that creates race in a certain sense.
Well, here's
so we would start.
Go ahead.
So will we start it with the slavery at around the Canary Islands, that time period, or could we go back even further and go back to the Middle Ages even? Because I know Geraldine Hang has a new book out that is recent as 2018, where she talks about the invention of race in the European Middle Ages, and there are other books that talk about it in antiquity as well. And I know it's a very in history it's still in debate whether we can look at race during those times without making like an anachronistic argument.
So here's my question, gentlemen, and perhaps anyone watching or watching retroactively as well, because that's probably going to be the majority of the audience, actually. But
probably.
If it seems that we can't define very clearly, now this needs to be understood not to be a conflation with that it couldn't be in principle, okay? But if we're struggling to define what race is and even what blackness means more specifically, but then we argue that this is the reason for a particular problem, it seems that we're in a bit of a pickle. Because now I have to argue, right, that the very thing I struggle to define informs an output for some set of inputs that I claim to be a problem. So even if I could well define the problem, it'd be a lot like saying, suppose that we understand the phenomenology of COVID, and then suppose I told you that something associated with COVID was was a possible correlation coefficient. But when you asked me to explain more concisely what that thing was, if I couldn't concretize it sufficiently, it's not that it's so. I want to make clear the difficulty in making such a concretization doesn't imply logically, right, that such a thing doesn't exist, but it does make very difficult. And maybe this is perhaps why these problems aren't easily addressed, right? Do you guys understand the question? Yeah,
but I thought you were going to add more to it.
I don't want to add more. I'm trying to keep it simple so it's workable, because we can easily make it too complex to where I don't want people to feel overwhelmed. I don't want to throw too many questions at any particular person.
Well, I mean, I would just say one thing to follow up on that like one issue with it is that like you have so say just to take the term blackness, like in growing up and in being black, like you have to live in that world without a definition of what the term means, right? Like you understand yourself as black, but you don't necessarily have to sit there and like write, a monolith about, okay, this is what blackness, or sorry, monogram, this is what blackness is. And you don't like, you live it and come to an understanding of it in like intuitively, and you have an idea of it, even if you've never come with a hard definition of it, right? And you can say, okay, who is and isn't black to a certain extent. Maybe not in all cases, but with an idea because of living in the world as a black person and like knowing the community of your family and the people that you've dealt with in your own community, right? Like, I would say take not as a directly analogous, but say like religion, right? Let's say like Judaism, which is always an interesting case because, it is a set of religious values and mores, but it is also an ethnic group. And so like you live and be Jewish in a certain way. You say certain things that are, certain Jewish people would do and not do. But like, you can also say convert into Judaism, but that might be something different than say being born Jewish, right?
Yeah.
But is that perhaps the questions that I've directly and implicitly raised part of why perhaps, or at least one correlation coefficient involved in why these issues may not be taken as seriously as they could be, or even are often dismissed as chasing ghosts, because we have a problem we believe is a problem, shall we say. So let us assume that let us table for a second the difficult philosophical quandary of whether there is a problem, and suppose there is. Even if there was, we then have the challenge of defining the things that we claim to be factors, right, involved in the problem itself, and it's hard to pin down and define those things. And if we fail to define them efficiently, people may be dismissive of the very problem in essence, right? In other words, they may start to think that. In other words, if you look at it from the bottom up, rather than the top down, so to speak, in this analogy, which is not logically correct to say that, but I'm just trying to make an analogy here. Then from the top up, you start to wonder if the problem itself exists. Right? In other words, if you get bogged down in the nebulous definition, then you start to question whether the thing it's claimed to be precursive to even exists fundamentally.
Well, then oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Sorry to steal your thunder. And
I'm not saying
actually,
I think this, I'm saying a person might be predisposed.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think that actually, like, having more questions about what race is and, like, if we can, how we can define it, can actually lead to looking more at the problems. For instance, I think that there's a debate on whether, like, Islamophobia is a type of racism and stuff like that. Of course, that comes with other problems as well, but then there are some who would say that that's...
Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example, Andrew. Suppose you have a cough, right?
Can you say that again?
Suppose you have a cough, right?
A cough, okay.
And let me say that I tell you that blue is the reason, right? Or is a very strong reason, right? It's not a, I mean, it's just a word. I'm using it because I'm just holding meaning there. It's just a sound, and this is supposed to be referent to something, but it's not clear what is it. And if you look at it from the top down and you just start with blue, right? You may become lost in thinking about what a blue is to logically infer any consequence from it, right?
Okay.
So starting from the supposition of what is a blue, and without any, is it right? Just blue. You just have a word. You may not infer any consequence from it.
Yeah.
Right. But looking from the top down, it's also problematic because then and that's what I mean. I'm not saying it's a necessary or sufficient condition, but that it's possible that a person may, in other words, what I'm conjecturing is does there exist a subset of individuals for whom part of the lack of concern with issues of this sort is not, it's not just that it's that, all the other many other problems associated with it, cognitive bias, right? As James said, maybe the tendency for people not to have a lived experience, but furthermore, the philosophical challenge of even concretizing not only terms, but by implication from those terms, the problems that we presuppose exist, right, are hard to actually from the bottom up even construct, right? Like in an economical model, you may start from individual instantiations of behavior, like game theory, to converge to a constructed market equilibrium that, while difficult to calculate, one can conceive of how it may result, right? Because at least the terms appear on their surface to be sufficiently well defined. Again, the lack of a precise definition, I want to make clear, is not evidence that the thing in question is not fundamentally existent, right? It may be the case that it's hard to pin down. But that's, have I better explained, James, like what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so like that, there are a fair amount of theorists who deal with that. So one is one I work with, Toril Moy, and she does that from a feminist perspective, where it's like, what is a woman? She has a paper called "What Is a Woman?" And so in that paper, she looks at, okay, there isn't, a single definition of what is a woman, like what a woman is, and the problem of a lot, and this comes from Wittgenstein. The problem is trying to always deal with it on the metaphysical level, assuming that in order to proceed about how to talk about, feminism, you have to have already a notion or a hard definition of what a woman is. And instead, she tells us, which is from Wittgenstein as well, to like look and see. So what you do is think about the ways in which you want to talk about feminism, or the ways in which you want to deal with a certain existent problem that you're very aware of, and then talk about women there, and look at an example and take your definition from that example, instead of just trying to deal with it always on the metaphysical level, because you'll always get stuck on, like Christopher's example of trying to deal with and understand what a blug is, and you'll get weighted down on what isn't the actual issue. The issue is, your cough and how do you fix it, right? And so do the same thing with race and sex. We're like, okay, if the problem is, the schools are insufficient, deal with that problem, as compared to, okay, we need to understand what a Black person is before we can address how do we help schools in this area with these children.
Right. And so there are two things, therefore, as you aptly put, Andrew, that I'm motivating further questions. I am. And those two questions are, is it therefore, it's not that it's irrelevant, but now the scope of the relevance of the question of what is Black, what is race, is now called into question, right? That's part of the problem here, because as you pointed out, it may be counterproductive to some level, right? To some extent, focusing only on what a Bloog is. But furthermore, and this is perhaps more disturbing, how do we know that a Bloog is not or is involved in the cough? Right? We come to a similar problem, is that we often see, if these problems are well understood, right, when they are observed, that people immediately go to, well, it's obviously because of Bloog. Right? And so it's not that we want to try to discuss Bloog too precisely, because perhaps that's not productive, but it's also not clear at the other end of the other perspective, shall we say, how we substantiate that Bloog is the problem from the supposition of not understanding what a Bloog really is very well. So it's complicated either way, right?
So not looking at it as like a monolithic problem, but like one maybe significant factor in the problem.
I wonder, I guess what I'm saying is, what if it's the case that in dealing with problems of this sort, we need to find so here's my question. If racism was a problem, and if the thing existed but was sufficiently nebulous that it was very difficult to concretize, would it actually be productive to discuss it?
Maybe. I have to say I don't know. I think so, but I don't know.
I would say yes, but in a way in which you're not trying to define it, right? So like for instance, if you're talking about baseball and how to make your team better at baseball, right? Like, oh, you need to trade for this player and get that player better. You don't need to have like a theory about what baseball is to get a better team, right? Like, you just need, we need somebody to hit. We need a better hitter on this team, and that's very clear what we need.
Right.
The same thing that's like, people are, Black people are disproportionately dying of diabetes. Like, you don't have to know like what Blackness is to deal with that problem. Just like, okay, we have an idea of who, or you also don't need to know exactly who is Black in every instance. You're just like, there are people that we call Black. They're disproportionately dying of diabetes. Let's fix that. And you can deal with it, have a discussion about, okay, how the healthcare system deals with these people without having to get into a real philosophical discussion about who is and who is not Black, or when race came into being, right? Because like, imagine if I'm a health minister, and you're like, okay, we have this large Black community and they're all dying, and you're like, but when did race come into being? And you're like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, we don't need to figure out when they came into being. They're here. Let's stop them from dying. Like, that's what we need to get into.
Because now let us imagine a person with enough influence, right? And let's kind of imagine the Ring of Gyges. Like, are you guys familiar? The Ring of Gyges?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Basically, he can put it on and get away with anything, so he can pretend to be good.
Oh, yes, yes. This is from Plato's Republic, right?
I don't know what it's from, but just I think it's included in that volume. Yes. And now let us imagine that this person, right? Let's say I'm that person, comes on, right, and motivates the conversation about what is race and how do we know, if it exists, that it's a cause of these problems, and that if they even exist, right? So what if one of the problems of why some people are perhaps even enraged about the whole discourse, right, is that a person can come in and start asking through logic, right, through logical inquiry, questions in a way that can shut down potential progress, right? And it doesn't have to be on a subject of race. I could come in on, let's say, COVID-19, and if I had enough authority, right, maybe, or enough influence that people would listen. And maybe if I could persuade the people necessary to treat COVID, e.g. doctors, if I was good enough at bullshit, right, where I made it complicated enough, I had all these fake equations, right, and I start trying to get them into thinking about, well, let's think about what COVID fundamentally is to understand what the real problem may be, right? it's kind of like that, where is it possible now that taking a person who may have sinister motives could actually use this very nebulous fact of the matter, right? When I say fact, I don't literally mean fact. I don't know. I don't know if such a thing even fundamentally exists, but we can now see a potential for a person can galvanize us into a state of uncertainty that results in a potential suspension of any action or resolution, right? And so the very method through which we congregate together to discuss and resolve it can be, if we're not careful, brought to a halt.
So one of the things with the Ring of Gyges, I think Thrasymachus is the one who says that what to be just as a response to this is to be just is to give your friends their due. And immediately I'm thinking, when I'm reading that in political thought, I'm thinking, well, but what if your friends are bad? So like,
I'm not saying, I want to make clear that when I'm discussing that, I don't want you to be thinking in the context of how Plato would define ethics or justice.
Okay.
What if those things exist, whatever they are? All I'm proposing is, if the Ring of Gyges is an applicable thought experiment to those metaphysical things, if existent, if we imagine a person with sinister intent, if such a thing is conceivable and tenable, that person uses the very nebulous problems that we've kind of implied through our discussion as a barrier to productive discourse. And what if that's perhaps why there are some people that aren't even interested in discussing it?
I mean, that does happen. I mean, there are some somewhat infuriating videos, that you can find online, where people will try to have discussion and they'll be like, talking about college or something, and someone will bring up, oh, well, this group is underrepresented, and then they're like, well, why are you talking about race? You always got to talk about race. Where one group will be talking about it, but in a kind of like opaque, kind of behind the scenes type of way, and not directly address that they're talking about race, even though they are.
Right. They'll often
just inciting it will cause a problem, because the second you mention race, now this is a racist discussion, and now we're talking about discrimination, and so now we have to deal with that, as compared to like just helping a certain group get representation.
Right. Because what I'm pointing out and motivating is it may not even be enough that people have that representation. Meaning, we could be having this conversation, but if I was good at persuading people and kind of unbeknownst to them, deceiving them in all this, philosophizing, I could confuse them, right? Meaning that if they weren't sufficiently grounded in their lived experience, meaning maybe theirs was such that. So imagine a person with a lived experience, James, had amnesia, right? And then I have this conversation with them about the difficulty of defining race and then attributing race, therefore, to this set of problems, since it's not sufficiently well defined, right? If they had amnesia, so I think in a way, the case of amnesia may inform as to the relevancy of the lived experience, perhaps, right? Because the set of all those neural connections in a person's brain, and that's not saying lived experience is gospel. I don't think anybody here is saying that. We're not saying that because schizophrenics and such, we're not saying, well, we better listen to what the schizophrenic tells us about the person outside, playing a violin. But it's a potentially worrisome, right? Because the very method by which we often assume we can solve problems can sometimes be literally, in this thought experiment, hijacked to paralyze us from seeing that it's even an existent problem if we're not careful, right? If we imagine a sufficiently competent person that, for all we know, persuades us to thinking such a thing, meaning let's assume that we make some logical fallacies in our thinking.
Well, so does this go back to what you said in the first video about why should we care? So could we maybe rephrase it like, why should the racist care?
Well, that's a different question entirely. Why should we care about racism? Is boy. I mean, that's right. Because why? For example,
I'm sorry.
No. I think it's a pertinent question, but it's like, suppose we could define what race is. Suppose we circumvent this problem entirely. It's all well defined. It's axiomatizable, right? And then you tell someone you're a bigot, you're a racist, and we can prove it. Suppose we could, right? Like deductively, we could have certainty. I mean, it's all absurd, but it seems. But just assume it's all possible, right? What if they just shrugged, right? So why would we then care? You know, even it's the same problem in a way, not literally the same, because there's a distinction between equivalency and sameness in logic. But they could just shrug, right?
Well,
yeah, go on.
Well,
Sorry.
I was going to take it back to the novel. So I mean, you have this kind of thing in the novel where, the dumb intellectuals, like they are just about meeting every week, and then they talk about philosophical issues, and they talk about defining these terms, and they talk about changing these texts to make them less offensive to Black people. But then, they all get in their cars and they drive away, and none of them actually live in Dickens, that neighborhood. None of them live in the ghetto.
Right.
And so the whole point is that, like, they can shrug their shoulders, they cannot care. But like, when it, like, your ability to find a job, or your health, or the people you're interacting with on a day-to-day basis are reliant upon some understanding of this issue. And if you are, a person of color, you can't, like, and you're living in this, you can't shrug your shoulders, because you can't stay inside your house forever, because you don't have the money or the resources to do that type of thing, and you have to go out and exist. And so it brings it back to, like, these, like, so I don't know if you guys are aware, like, these Morean proofs, where, like, Moore talks about proving whether you have hands by the ability to pick something up. And so this is similar to that, in that, like, yeah, you can go into these certain discourses, but at the end of the day, you have to go out and be a Black person in society. And so you have to always consider it on a certain level, and you can't get to you can't remain in only the philosophical realm, the abstract, metaphysics of it, because you actually have to go out and do stuff. And so you have to have that practical definition to a certain aspect, or certain.
Kind of like I'm
not sure how long we're going to go on. I probably have to head out in around like 5 or 6 minutes. I don't know how long we're going to.
Okay. That's fine. That's fine. We pretty much planned for about this duration. That's what most of them are.
1:30.
Okay.
Yeah.
That kind of makes me think of, like, some ancient Greek thought, where they're like, there's an infinite amount of space between, say, me and someone who's 5 feet away from me.
Well, all right, be careful. All right, infinite amount.
So I think what he's talking about there.
Yes. But that's the actual, at least as I thought that I understood it. I thought that's what they were saying, but yeah, we would definitely say more like in increments.
Yeah, so I think, like, if space is infinitely divisible, and you can always divide a space.
Yeah, that's a better way to phrase it. That's a better way to phrase it. It would be called a compact space, or a complete metrizable space.
Yeah, that you could divide it continuously and never end dividing it, which means that you would never actually get to that actual next location. The arrow would never actually get where it's going. But then you can obviously just walk there, and then, like, you're there. So.
Well, there is a resolution to that, but I feel like if we discuss the logic, we might derail the conversation. And I don't want to hold you for any longer. So let's say this: we can conclude here. Anyone in the comments currently watching can join us in the after party and discussing anything we discussed here. It won't be live though, and that way, James, we can let you go out your day. We thank you for your time. It's been a real blast. And I think we can just end it here. You guys fine with that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure.
All right, sounds good. So I'm just going to close the broadcast now. So there we go. And